Well, hello again, and welcome to part 11 of the Penny Family History Slideshow. So, this one's going to be a slightly different episode. Not so much about the Penny family this time. This is about my mother and her backstory and the backstory of Hungary. So it's a fairly long episode, and it'll be of particular interest to my Virany family. Probably less interest to the Penny family because I go into a lot of detail, but you might be interested in my mom's background anyways. So before we get started, though, let's have a toast. I'll take my single malt scotch, and let's have a toast to the Penny family and the Virany family this time, and to the great kingdom of Hungary and the new Democratic Republic of Hungary as well. Cheers, everybody. All right, let's get into it. So once again, here's my mom. This picture was taken around 1953 when she was married to my dad, Douglas Penny. She was born 1932 in Budapest, left Hungary in 1948. She arrived in Canada by the end of 49. She got married to my dad in 53, became a citizen in 54. She then worked as a teacher and as a school administrator in a very high position for a woman at the time. She retired in 1988 to help look after the kids, and she passed away in 2021, aged 89 years old. She's been living with me for the past year before that. Here she is in 2015, aged 83, still looking quite youthful. So where exactly is Hungary? Well, it's over here in Central Europe. As you can see, London and Italy over here. That's Russia over here. The Ukraine borders the Ukraine a little bit as well. And there's various states around it that were fairly newly created states after the First and the Second World War to a certain extent. And there's Budapest in the center where my mom was born. So Hungary is located in what's known as the Carpathian Basin, which is the area between all of these mountains over here. And while modern-day Hungary, which is there, is rather smaller than the Carpathian Basin, historical Hungary, as it existed for about 1,000 years, occupied this entire area over here. It was also called the Pannonian Basin, after the name the Romans gave to the province. And in prehistory, various tribes, warring tribes, fought it out. I know one tribe was big enough to take it all. Then the Romans took it, and then eventually it became a kingdom after Rome fell, which occupied this entire area. Similar to the island of England, which was isolated because it was an island, so was Hungary quite isolated because of these natural geographic boundaries around it. So let's just do a lightning tour of the history of Hungary. Around 156, the Romans came in and they cleared out all of these warring tribes in these area, and you can see the boundary of the Roman Empire cutting through modern-day Hungary, and they were fighting off the barbarians on that side. When Rome eventually fell, Attila the Hun came in. He was a people from the eastern regions, and they came in overwhelming numbers and took that entire Carpathian Basin. When Attila died, the Avars came in, another similar people, more closely related to Turks, and they took over that region. And they were eventually fought off by Charlemagne, the Christian king and the first Holy Roman Empire, and they defeated the Avars. But there was a bit of a power vacuum, and a second wave of Hungarians, of Huns, came in, called the Hungarian Conquest of 895. And for the next 100 years or so, they raided all over Europe until King Stephen I, who was the first Christian king of Hungary and the first king of Hungary. Before that, it was a federation of several tribes, of which the leader was the first amongst equals. And with Stephen, it was the first time there was a king, and it was a Christian king at that. And they became eventually the Holy Roman Empire's emperors as well, and the leaders of Christendom. They were really on the boundaries fighting the non-Christians. In 1222 was an event called the Golden Bull, which was similar to Magna Carta in England, where the king had to agree to divide his power with an upper house of parliament, if you will. The first Habsburg came in by marriage in 1437, and the Habsburg base was in Austria. So they became both kings of Austria and kings of Hungary, as well as Croatia and Serbia and other things like that. It was Albert I, who was also a Holy Roman Emperor, meaning that he was the leader of Christendom. In 1703, the people in Hungary were feeling threatened by the big Central Empire of Austro-Hungary, and there was a Rákóczi's War of Independence, which sought to reinforce the fact that Hungary was its own separate and distinct kingdom. Rákóczi was a noble, but he had both nobles and peasants on his side. And while the rebellion was put down, the king of Hungary had to agree to abide by the rules. In 1740, Maria Theresa came along, a very enlightened monarch in everything except religion. She reigned for about 40 years, from 1740 to 1780, but she was a Catholic and she did persecute Protestants and Jews. However, her son, Joseph II, was what's called an enlightened monarch, but he was also an absolutist, so he was a bit of a despot, but he was a very enlightened despot. And he passed what was called the Patent of Toleration, then the Edict of Tolerance, which made Hungary in particular very friendly towards Jews. In his way of thinking, it was all right for you to practice your religion, but he wanted the Jews not to be so overtly Jewish. He wanted them to abandon the use of Hebrew as a language for commerce and legal contracts. He wanted all the young Jews to attend school, to learn the same languages as everybody else. He didn't want the Jews wearing distinctive clothes at all. He wanted them to shave their beards. But in exchange, he made them much more equal partners in the realm and removed all the restrictions from the Jews. So many Jews who liked that deal, they piled into Hungary during this time. The Habsburg rule went on. It was by the time you got to Ferdinand V of Hungary, the line was a little bit inbred. He was said to suffer from about 20 epileptic seizures per day. And when he tried to consummate his marriage, he apparently suffered 5 seizures in the attempt. He was well known for when he asked for apricot dumplings of his cook, and the cook told him apricots weren't in season. He famously said, "Ich bin der Kaiser und ich will Knödel." I am the king and I want dumplings. I was teased by that when I was a kid by my uncle Ernest. By 1848, he abdicated in favor of Franz Josef and his empress Sisi, Elizabeth, known as Sisi. Sisi was a favorite of the Hungarians, a particular favorite of a certain Count Andrassy, who was the leader of the Hungarians, and they were said to have had an affair. At the time when Franz Josef took over from Ferdinand, the Hungarian people were again revolting against this kind of centralized rule from Austria, and when Franz Josef came in, he made it worse by trying to eliminate this notion of individual kingdoms inside his empire and replace them by just administrative provinces, dividing up these kingdoms and erasing the notion of Hungary as a kingdom. And as a result, the Hungarian Revolution of 1848 started up. The Hungarians didn't want any part of that. And that was fought, and it was only barely won by Franz Josef when he brought in Russians to help him out. And that was not received very well by the Hungarians. So there was, while the revolutionaries were defeated, that caused a lot of bad feelings. So much so that Franz Josef was stabbed in the neck by a Hungarian separatist at some point, and then the crackdowns got even worse after that. So that was the Hungarian Revolution, and that was right around the time my mom's grandfather was born, right into that period of Hungarian upset. In 1867, the dual monarchy of Hungary and Austria was formed as a compromise. So Franz Josef had gotten into a number of foreign policy disasters, the biggest of which was the Austro-Prussian War, where the Prussians, which were a part of Germany, took over Germany, really, and wanted to extend their empire. They came into conflict with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Franz Josef fought Otto von Bismarck, and he was defeated. And the Hungarians were not very enthusiastic because they weren't for Franz Josef at all. But the Hungarians came in and saved his bacon, led by Count Andrassy, with the influence of Sisi. But as a result, Franz Josef had to agree that Hungary was its own independent kingdom with its own independent laws, and the compromise was put together. whereby he would rule as king of Hungary and king of Austria. However, Hungary would have its own independent state, its own administration, its own elected officials, its own ministers, everything. The only thing in common was foreign policy and the War Department and the Treasury that would fund just those things. It was in this then period after that, which was relatively peaceful, that my mom's dad was born in 1899. Well, in 1914, along comes World War I, of which the Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy was a belligerent. And, well, as you know, they lost that war. And as a result of that, the Treaty of Trianon came along. And the Treaty of Trianon was very disastrous for Hungary. The previous extent of Hungary was this larger area out here. And after the treaty, they created these new states of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia and extended Romania and gave Hungarian lands to all of these surrounding countries. And you can see by the pie charts with the red, the number of Hungarians who are now stranded in these new non-Hungarian states over here. So all in all, Hungary lost about 72% of its land and 52% of its people. The Hungarians never could accept that. And they taught in schools for a long time that the boundaries of Hungary were the bigger areas over here, and these parts were only temporarily occupied, and they would get them back, if not by diplomacy, then by force eventually. After the war, though, there was a lot of unease in what was left of Hungary, and eventually came in a group of socialists called the Hungarian Democratic Republic, but they were actually quickly replaced by a bunch of communists called the Hungarian Soviet Republic. This was led by this fella Bela Kun, and there was something called the Red Terror, where they went on a tear, just like they did in Russia, the Bolsheviks, just before. They started arresting upper-class people, aristocrats, or wealthy factory owners and landowners, and executing them. That was called the Red Terror. Then in 1920, Milkos Horthy came in. He was a former soldier in the Austro-Hungarian Empire who had really retired off to a farm, but he was disturbed when the communists came in, the Bolsheviks came in, and he feared all his land would be expropriated and he'd be murdered. So he agreed to lead the armed forces, and they pushed back against this, and they won, and they reestablished a monarchy. And at the time, there was the son of Franz Josef was available. However, it would have been unacceptable to all the Allied forces for another Habsburg to come in. So Horthy acted as the regent, the king in absentia, if you will, and acted that constitutional role. Following Milkos Horthy coming in, there was something called the White Terror, where anyone who was a communist was brutally suppressed. There was also a confusion with the Jews. Bela Kun was a Jew, and apparently 40 of his 46 cabinet members were all Jews. Even though the Jewish were a minority of the population, they were very important in these Bolshevik revolutions. And so anti-communism and anti-Jewishness became tied together, unfortunately, and so Jews were repressed as well as communists, and in some horrible ways. Milkos Horthy did not approve of the excesses of some of his officers and wouldn't believe at first that his officers would carry out these horrible things. However, he eventually saw that they were, and he had them court-martialed at the end of the day. Once everything settled down, everything was fairly calm, and that's when my mom's parents married in around 1929. In 1930, my mom's brother was born, and then in 1932, she was born. So Hungary at that time was fairly calm. There was a bit of an anti-Semitism in the air because of the communists, and Jews were converting because they really didn't want to be associated with those Bolshevik communists, and if they weren't particularly religious Jews, they just converted to Catholicism or Calvinism, Protestant form of Christianity as well. And many of them changed their names to be more Hungarian and were Hungarian patriots. And Horthy was generally, while anti-Semitic as a rule, because he hated the communists so much and he tied those two things together, he was not for murdering them, and he was for giving them mostly equal rights as well, as long as they were good Hungarian citizens. So that was the world in which my mom was born. So my mom was born in March 31st, 1932, and here she is aged 3.5 months, July 18th, 1932. And this is all taken from an album that my grandmother maintained that I scanned in. And that's not my grandmother there. That's her nurse. They belonged to a very wealthy family, and they had many servants running around, including nurses and tutors and private doctors and dentists and things like that. Here's her birth certificate. This was reissued October 24th, 1947, just in order to get them out of Hungary. They left in October of 49. So she was born March 31st. Her official name was Maria Anna Veronica Virany. It says on there, girl and Roman Catholic. So if you see over here, that's her name, Maria Anna Veronica. That's Hungarian for girl, and our Catholic is Roman Catholic as well. So her parents were clearly Roman Catholics, as was she, even though they were all of Jewish background. It gives the street where they were born in the 7th region of Budapest, which is actually the region where the synagogue is, and right downtown. It's a very swanky part of town. And her parents were Laszlo Virany and Klara Tibold. So here's Laszlo Virany. This is my mom's father. He was born in October 28th, 1899 in Budapest. And he died in 1948 in Rome, and I'll get into that story. He was the third youngest of 10 siblings, one of whom died early. His mother was Maria Leitersdorfer. She went by Maria, but it was Irma Maria Leitersdorfer. And she only died in 1954 in Budapest. And the father of Laszlo Virany was Samu Wellis. He was born in Bögöte, Hungary, and died in 1922 in Budapest. He changed his name to Virany on September 16th, 1904. Again, this was all part of this idea that you didn't want to be that associated with the Jews, and there was a bit of anti-Semitic feeling even then. And he received a permit from the Interior Ministry to change his name, which they thought would be a good idea, as he was a big industrialist, Samu Wellis, as I'll get to, and he wanted to do a lot of business with the Hungarian government, and they thought it would be better if he appeared more Hungarian, and he was a pragmatist, if nothing else. But this is my grandfather, Laszlo Virany. As you can see, a very handsome man. So here's the entire family on a family tree. There's Laszlo, and here's all the brothers and sisters of Laszlo, and the ex is the one who died early. So there are really effectively nine siblings. So he had 8 siblings who lived on. This is the point at which they changed their name. So he was already alive and was known as Wellis, and then they all changed their name to Virany. They were married in 1886, Samuel Wellis and Maria Leitersdorfer. Samuel Wellis's father was Salomon Wellis, and his mother was Therese Hollander. He was a shopkeeper in Bögöte, and was apparently well-to-do, but not fantastically rich. Samuel Wellis became fantastically rich. He had a ton of money, and I'll get into all the businesses he was in a moment. Maria was an illegitimate child born to a mother called Nina Epstein. There was an unknown father involved. Nina's sister was Therese Epstein, who had married Lipot Leiterdorfer. And these two were childless. They weren't able to have children of their own. So they adopted Nina's daughter, Maria, and treated her as their own. They were also quite a wealthy family. The father of Therese Epstein was, interesting, Dr. David Epstein, who was jailed in part of the 1948 revolution for being an army doctor to the revolutionaries. Nina Epstein later went on to marry a fellow named Vilmos Adler, and they had a number of other children, apparently. Maria, while she didn't keep in touch with her biological mother very much, when she was in her old age, and Maria was very rich from being the wife of this incredibly rich industrialist, she did help out Nina in her old age and apparently helped out some of the kids as well. Maria got a very good education from the Leiterdorfers, and she was very, very fond of her adopted mother, Therese Epstein, as well. So here's Samuel Wellis. This was the marriage record of Samuel Wellis, known as Samu Wellis, at age 30. They were married in near Budapest. His father was Samu Wellis, and his mother was Therese Hollander, as I mentioned, and his spouse was Maria Irma Leitersdorfer. He was a self-made businessman. He left to go to Czechoslovakia at 14 to stay with an uncle, and he earned his first income by playing chess in restaurants professionally and betting money. When he got back to Budapest, he founded a lumber production business. And then when he thought that the business was going to suffer some bad times, he sold it at a very good price and got out. He then became 30% owner of a coal importing business, which was absolutely huge. He then built and owned a great hotel. And he founded the Screw Steamer Limited that operated all the ferries on the Danube. At a certain point at the peak, they transported about 5 million passengers annually on 13 steamships. He later sold it and made a huge estate based on this. He then founded the sugar refinery, which also provided a huge income. At one point, he was offered to be a baron by the Emperor Franz Joseph, and he'd have to pay $75,000 in today's money for the privilege. He refused it. He didn't care to be that. So in his house, there were 4 servants, plus a nanny, a governess, a house tutor, a piano teacher, a French teacher, an English teacher, a doctor, and a dentist. And apparently the house expenses were about $1.5 million a year in today's money. So I got this information from my Uncle Tom, who put together some remembrances of his own and from a cousin, Judith, as well. And so there are a couple of those documents and all of these things and stuff my mother remembered as well. And they're very invaluable. He was, one of his saying was, "I'm not rich enough to buy cheaply." So that means if you buy something cheap, it'll wear out and it won't be any good and you'll have to throw it out and buy another one. So he always was fond of high quality things. These are all of the children listed down here, and I'll go through them one by one. The first one was Desho, and Desho was apparently very tall. They say he was in excess of 2 meters, and that's perhaps why he was shot, because it was hard for him to crouch low. He died on the Italian front at Flitz, and this was in World War I, after apparently a miraculous escape from the Russian front, where nobody was expected to live, and he got to the Italian front, and then he died at that point. So he died quite young. The next one in order was Egon. Egon was a character, and I'll have more to say about Egon later, but he had his doctorate in politics and was a concert-level pianist. He was a very outspoken. He was the father of the person we know as Aunt Anne, a cellist who lived in Bern, and 2 other girls, Clary and Judith. Next was Alfred. Alfred was a chemist, and for a time he lived in San Francisco for about a decade, and where he was apparently quite famous, well known as a chemist there, and he returned to Hungary. He worked at the sugar refinery in the family business. He married a woman named Lili Politzer, and they had a son named Gabor. And we met Lili and Gabor when we visited Hungary. Lili Politzer is from the Politzer family, which has the Politzer Prize. Next was Renko, or known as René. She married a very distinguished lawyer, and she was the mother of a woman named Baba Nani, who married a guy named Paul Backer from a big business, the Tungsram monopoly. He was killed by Nazis. After the war, she married a U.S. electrical engineer. She divorced, and then she committed suicide over the failed marriage. My grandmother tried to get her to come to Toronto, but she killed herself. Gita lived at home, and he became the chauffeur for his mother. And after World War II, in communist Hungary, he worked as an elevator inspector. Gyuri was the one who died as an infant at age 2 of pneumonia. Uncle Paul, we knew Paul quite well as kids because he would come and visit Toronto. And every time he came to visit, he would take all the kids out to the big toy store in downtown Toronto and allow us to buy any toy we wanted. He had made quite a bit of money. He drove this giant American Cadillac. He lived in the States. He was a distinguished artillery officer in World War I. He lived in the U.S. for 10 years illegally between the wars. He had some dispute with my grandfather over money, but they buried the hatchet in 1943, given the distressing times. He founded a chocolate factory in Budapest after World War II. When the communists came in, he was convicted to 8 years in prison on trumped-up charges by the communists for supposedly smuggling chocolate. And the communists wanted to make an example of the capitalists, and so they grabbed them and convicted them on all sorts of things. So this was very much a show trial. They had all the evidence kind of gathered and ready to go, and it was all nonsense, apparently. But Egon got him out by basically threatening the minister in charge of exposing his nephew. Anyways, he eventually moved to Connecticut as a political refugee, and he ran a company that reconditioned dental equipment. Then there's Laszlo, and I'll say more about Laszlo later, my grandfather. And then there was Mucineni, Andrea. She and her husband had good foresight and managed to save a big portion of their estate, and they moved to Brazil. Muci's daughter, Susan Erdos, married Giusi Milko, and Milko owned a fastener company in Brazil, and he's the parent of Paul and Tommy Milko. And we've met, Tommy came and actually stayed with us and lived with us for quite some time. And finally, there was Magda Neni. She lived after the war, lived in New York, Cleveland, Milan, then Vienna. And she married a fellow, Joska, who did work for Glidden Paints as I think, an executive role. So that was the entire family. Now, this is Egon over here. So remember, Egon was the second child. The first one died in World War I. Egon was the second one. He kind of became the head of the family after his father died. So this is him and his family. This is Egon. This is Aunt Anne Ontzi, who was a cellist who lived in Bern. This is her sister, Judith, over here. And this is their other sister, Klara Virany. Different than my grandmother, was also a Klara Virany. She was married to Lajos Molnar over here. And this is Ella Virany, which is Egon's wife, Ella. So a little bit about Egon. He was the head of the family after his older brother Desho and father Samu passed. He passed in 1922. He had what was called a spectacular personality, neither very liked or very disliked, highly outspoken on any issue, political included. His wife, Ellis, once said, after he said something that disturbed a bunch of people, she said, now nobody will like Egon any longer but I. So he apparently made the lives of everyone around him a bit difficult by his strong and outspoken convictions. They converted to be Calvinists. As I mentioned, he was a doctorate in politics and a concert-level pianist. He was a sportsman. He loved skiing. He did apparently 80 push-ups a day into his old age, which my Uncle Tom has kept up, and I should definitely do the same. He worked at the sugar refinery, also served in the war for 4 years. He gave his daughter Onsi's cello to friends for safekeeping during the Siege of Budapest, which I'll get to later, in a house that was later occupied by Russians. He just went in this house with all the Russian soldiers there, found it and took it home. And when those friends later apologized for losing it, he told them, no worries, I went and picked it up. He was once arrested by Nazis and taken to a certain place in the basement of a hotel that very few ever came out alive. They beat him and asked him if he deserved it. And he said, sure, if not in this life, then in a previous one. In 1951, apparently a neighbor filed a complaint against him, and 2 men came by and asked for his political opinions. He told them basically that he didn't like the communists at all. And then he turned around after they left and said to Ellis, I told them, didn't I? And she said, yes, and in 2 weeks they'll deport us. And they did. That's what they did at the time. If they didn't like your politics, they would deport you way off to some very remote region of the country, or even sometimes into Russia, although they were deported to a remote region of Hungary, where they were basically given a subsistence level job as farmers. And so that's what happened, in fact. Now, Ellis was exempt from the anti-Jewish legislation because of apparently the interior minister, Andor Yaros, due to, I guess he was known to the family and due to his good graces, she was not treated as a Jew. However, she followed Egon and Egon's mother, Maria, into a house designated for Jews. But it wasn't a Yellow Star house. It was a house that was under Swiss protection. So Jews would, different embassies would establish houses under their protection, and Jews that were known to them would go into those houses and be protected from the worst excesses, and they did live through the war, but not without a number of close calls. He apparently played scales on his piano twice a week for 45 minutes, and he played so fast that sweat poured off him. After 1949, when Onsi left and he was deported, he said, well, Onsi's left. There's no sense playing anymore, because Onsi was such a wonderful cellist, and he loved playing music with her. After 1964, and after the other daughter Judith was divorced, he moved in with her, and he began to play again. His piano was kept by Judith while he was deported. He had a companion in old age named Vilma, a piano teacher, and they played music together, went for walks, went to exhibitions, but he never married her. Now, on to Alfred. So Alfred is Laszlo's older brother, my great uncle. And there's actually a book written about the Politzer family called the Politzer Saga by Linda Ambrusch. Linda collected a bunch of family stories of hers, and some of which referenced Alfred, Lili, Lili Politzer, and Gabor. So this is this family, Alfred, Lili, and Gabor. And Lili's sister was Elizabeth. Her son was Gyula, and one of his daughters was Linda over here. Now, she recounted meeting Gabor, who has a photographic memory. He remembers absolutely everything that has ever happened to him, important or unimportant, in his life. And so she got a lot of information from Gabor about the family history. And this is Lili Naney, Lili Politzer, Gabor's mother, just a few years before she died in Hungary. That's me in the middle. Kathleen and I were touring Europe, and we stopped by in Hungary, and we visited Gabor, whom I had met. Gabor and Lili Naney I had met years earlier, actually, when my family went there as well. And so it was just interesting. I had a very similar experience to Linda's. So if we look down the family tree a little bit, start with Laszlo and Klara Tibold, and they married, and they had Tom and Marianne. And Tom had 3 children, Leslie, Paula, and Sandra. And my mom had 2 of us, L'Oreal, my older sister, and myself. So that's how we fit in. The younger sister of Laszlo, called Andrea, or Mutsi Naney, she was the one who went to Brazil, and she was the one who had a daughter, Susan, who married Milkos, and that's how we know Paul and Tom. So Laszlo, a little bit more about Laszlo. Laszlo married my grandmother Klara and had Tom and Marianne. And this was the house that they grew up in when I visited. So Laszlo didn't go to university. He was too young for World War I. He was very intelligent, obviously good looking, tall, athletic, very outspoken as well, aggressive, self-assertive. In 1920, he joined Alfred in San Francisco, and in 1921, he returned to Hungary. Alfred left him there with no money, and he had to work his way back as a stoker on a steamship. He went from San Francisco to Vancouver, and up the Panama Canal, and then over to France. And then in France, he had to dial his dad for money to get home to Hungary. Initially, he worked as a banker for a time, but then after a while, he founded the Gay V hosiery factory with a guy named Imre Gerber. And he used part a bank loan, and part family money to found this business. There was apparently some tough depression years, but after that, he became wildly successful, and he had 17 giant machines churning out silk stockings and exports all over the place. So of all of those children, he was the wealthiest, the most successful and the wealthiest. So in 1929, he married Klara, and in 1930, he had Tom, and then in 1932, Marianne. And here's the marriage certificate for Laszlo Virany and Klara Tibold. You can see the names of Laszlo's father, Samu Wellis, and Maria Leitersdorfer. And you can see also Klara Tibold's family, Sandor, that actually says Sandor Tibold, and Sarolta Lichtenstein. So this is my grandmother's father and mother. His original name was Sandor Deutsch, and they later changed that name to Tibold. Again, I guess Deutsch was maybe a more Jewish associated name, and Tibold was a more Hungarian associated name. He was born in the town of Isak, which is down here. It's about 100 kilometers from Budapest. He married Sarolta Lichtenstein, and she was born in 1876 near Debrecen, which is probably the second biggest city in Hungary at the time. And they got married in Debrecen. I guess maybe Sandor was appointed there. He's in his hussar uniform. He had the saber and he rode horses. Sandor was a gentleman farmer, so he had a large amount of land that he farmed using very advanced techniques for the time. So he was a gentleman farmer. And my grandmother grew up on that farm in the Puszta. The Hungarian plains make up most of this area, and so she was in the Puszta, and she always loved the Puszta. My grandmother loved horses and dogs and animals of all sorts, and loved the outdoors. This is Sarolta's father and mother, Moses Lichtenstein and Hannah Fried, again all from Debrecen. So here's the family tree going up. Sarolta Lichtenstein and Sandor Deutsch were my grandmother's father and mother. Sarolta was born to Moses and Hannah, and Moses's father was Marton, and his father was Noah. And Sandor's father was Joseph Deutsch, and his father was Matthias Deutsch. And Sandor also had a number of brothers as well. Gyula, Frigyes, Zsigmond, Ida. Sarolta had some siblings as well, Desho and Samuel. Here's a bigger family tree. There's my grandmother, who had my mom. I'd be down at this level here, and Tom. And those are her parents. Now, my grandmother had a sister, Anna, who died in 1975. Remember my grandmother going to her funeral. She had a couple of children. Koti, who married Bela Esterhazy of the famous Esterhazy, the family of the Count, although he says he was a bit of a distaff branch of that family, but it was the family of the Count of Esterhazy. He was a very powerful nobleman in Europe who supported musicians such as Haydn. She also had a brother, and the brother had a daughter named Klara Foti. Klara married a fellow named Tibor, and they had a couple of kids, Esther and Peter. Klara and Tibor came to visit us, I remember, at the cottage, and Tibor was born on a farm, and he didn't want to sit around and idle and do nothing. Unfortunately, we had a building project, mixing concrete and building a big platform for a hot tub, and he threw himself right into that effort. He very much enjoyed that, I thought. And Peter actually stayed with us. They left Peter with us, and he stayed with us over the entire summer. And Esther also stayed with us in Toronto for a time as well. So we know that side of that family. Then if we look at Sarolta, there was Samuel and Desho. Desho had a daughter that we knew as Bojoneni. And Bojo had Dolly and Hetty. They all lived in New York. They had a wonderful rent-controlled apartment on the Upper West End of New York. And they were paying almost nothing for it for many, many, many years. There was another child, Samuel Lichtenstein, over here. And he had one of his daughters was someone we knew as Morika Neni, who lived in Mamaroneck in New York. She was a violinist. And she had a daughter named Esther. Esther eventually remarried a fellow named Barclay. And Esther and Barclay would come by Toronto quite frequently because Barclay was born in Toronto, actually. Barclay was a larger-than-life individual, a very large man. He was in the Olympics at one point as well, and he was an organist in the church, and he was a very cultured man, spoke with a British accent, and a fantastic fellow. We much enjoyed having them visit. So here's Tom, who gets born on June 25th, 1930, and there was his mom, my grandmother, Klara, at the time. And that's Klara there, looking down on him. And there's Laszlo with Tom. and a number of baby pictures of Tom, and Tom with his teddy bear. And yet more pictures of Tom. There's a lot of baby pictures of Tom, fewer of Marianne. I know that was the same when we had our first child, got all the pictures, and our second child got relatively fewer. It's the way of people, I guess. But also, I think there were more and more shortages in Hungary, and probably more and more difficult. Now, I think in this picture here in the background, I blew it up. I think that might be Sarolta, which is Klara's mother. And I believe that this is as my grandmother's mother and father. And I'm not sure who this one, but this could be Dolly at age 6. I'm not with Tom. That would be about the right ages for everybody concerned. And here's Tom again, and Tom with his father, Laszlo, my grandfather. There's a great picture of Tom saluting. There must have been a march going on outside or something. And again, I'm not sure who these girls are, but they could be Hetty and Dolly, based on the ages. Uncle Tom would have to correct me if he when he sees this. Please send me a note, Uncle Tom. And then my mom is born. She's her full name is Maria Anna Veronica Virany. In Hungarian, the NY is its own distinct letter, and it's a diphthong, and you don't really say the Y much. And the vowels have various accents on them, indicating how they're to be pronounced. So she was born March 31st, 1932, and there she is with the nurse. And there's Tom at that age as well. There's some more pictures of Tom, and yes, that is Tom with a cigarette in his mouth. Yeah, they didn't think cigarettes were bad for you at that time. I think they were considered healthy, but they didn't give them to kids to smoke. It was just pretending to be like one of the grown-ups, I guess. There's a lovely picture of Laszlo and Tom. And there's more of Tom. That's the bigger kid here. And these is Tom, and the other one is Marianne. Here I took one and blew them up. So that's my mom. This is in 1933, April. So she was just 1 year old here. So she's already toddling around, which I thought was pretty advanced for that age. And there's the two children, again with Laszlo. And there I took this photo and blew it up and corrected it. That's Tom and Laszlo and Marianne on Laszlo's lap. Here's Tom and Marianne. Now into 1934. And there's one of the relatively rare photos of my grandmother, who actually looking at the camera. She hated her whole life having her picture taken. And whenever a camera started going off, she would generally look away. So there's very few good pictures of my grandmother. So that's why this one is relatively rare. They actually caught her looking at a camera. And there's my mom in 1934. So she was 2 years old by now, 2 and a bit, being July 30th. She was born March 31st. She's already getting on a bit of her personality, I would say. I kind of recognize that look. And there the kids on a bicycle. Here she's riding that bike. I blew this one up for my mom. There's a nice one of Tom as well here. There's another one of Marianne and sitting on someone's lap. I'm not exactly clear who that is. Recall in Canada around the same time, 1935, everybody was proud of their fancy new cars. Although this car looks like it takes the cake. It looks like a 12-cylinder job and was a very fancy vehicle at the time. Laszlo, as I said, was very wealthy and he could afford the best of whatever. And this looks to be like a very fancy car that Laszlo. So we share that in common. I like the fancy cars myself. And there's my mom with the typical child's toy at the time, which was a hoop and a stick to push the hoop. So none of these smartphones. They just ran around the streets pushing hoops with sticks, and that was good enough for those kids. There they are skating. They were a very sporty family. They would do a lot of sports. My grandmother, Laszlo, the whole Virany family, they would do gymnastics. They would be skiing. There's a hill almost right inside Budapest, which was a fairly high hill. Not a mountain or anything like that in Budapest, but you could go to it and have a very good skiing down that mountain. And a number of, certainly all the upper crust Hungarian families would go skiing up and down that mountain. And so they skied and they skated and they did gymnastics and various other athletic ventures as well. But that's a lovely picture of Tom and Marianne. There's my mom with that look again. Certainly looks like she's going to amount to something, I think. Tom is a good expression. Oh, there's my sister going again. And here they are in front of a biplane, looking at a plane, I guess. And there they are again. Marianne looks like she's growing very quickly, catching up to Tom. I think this was on a vacation. And again, they're on a beach somewhere. I'm sure that says the name of the beach, but I'm not exactly sure where they were. But there are lots of lovely beaches and seaside towns that were very accessible from Hungary. And as I said, there they are doing gymnastics with their gymnastics instructors over here. And here we are in 1937. So Tom is 7 years old and Marianne is 5 years old. My mom's looking rather mature, I'd say, for a 5-year-old. And again, there she is. Like I say, she does look quite mature for that age, but you can tell she's still got her doll. And there's Tom riding a horse. That's all upper crust young men would learn to do. I guess that's maybe his riding outfit. And there's Laszlo with Tom and Marianne. And again, skating. And I blew up this photo here. That's my grandmother and Laszlo. Again, it was very hard to get a picture of my grandmother. She'd always turn away from the photos. Here they are on holidays. And this is where they went. So here's Hungary. This is Czechoslovakia right next door. It was at the time, it was a unified country of Czechoslovakia, more recently divided into the two countries. And this is in the mountains over here, where they went for a summer holiday. This nice looking resort. And there they are, I think. This looks like to be around the time they're leaving Hungary. I think that's Laszlo still there. That might be another, could be Uncle Paul, perhaps. I'm not sure. Again, Uncle Tom will have to fill me in. And here's some other a studio photograph of my mom, which I think is one of the better pictures from her childhood. There's a big gap in photos from here until they arrive in Canada, and she starts going out with my dad because there's the war years intervening. And it was the same thing in Canada. There weren't a lot of pictures during that time because I think the chemicals used for making the photos were in short supply. So a fairly nice, idyllic childhood. Although right around the time my mom was born in 1932, Hitler started coming up. Boo hiss. So Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933. He was elected chancellor, although he was on the scene before that. And it was largely fueled by punitive measures against Germany after World War I, created the conditions whereby he could rise to power. Hitler himself had lived in Vienna and had fought in the trenches during World War I. He was intensely paranoid about the Jews and their relationship to the Bolsheviks and global communism. His 1925 book, Mein Kampf, My Struggles, that he wrote while in prison, has huge pages and pages and pages of paranoid ravings about Jews. So he went on a mission to try to restore the previous might of Germany. And he, after basically just walking into Austria and Czechoslovakia and nobody saying anything really about that, So as you can see, this is a map from Germany. They took all of Czechoslovakia and then this was formerly Austria, took all of this. There's Vienna. And it appeared that Germany would be the dominant power inside Europe at that time because nobody had yet challenged Hitler. Nobody wanted to because he had developed a huge industrial base and they had a huge population and he was being rather aggressive about things. And to try to get Hungary onto his side, Hungary was kind of naturally aligned with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Austro-Hungarian Empire was aligned with Germany in World War I, and they were all treated very badly in the Treaty of Versailles. So after taking those places, they had what was called the Vienna Awards, where Hitler agreed to give Hungary back part of the area that it had lost after World War I to try to redress some of the stuff that was done at that time. And so he did that. And so Hungary was very conflicted. There were elements of fascist elements inside of Hungary, but it was by no means a majority. And Miklos Horthy at the time, while he hated the communists, the Bolsheviks, with an absolute passion, he did not like the extreme right-wing fascists either. He actually banned their party, the Arrow Cross Party. It was banned, as well as the Bolshevik Party was banned from participating in politics. But Germany appeared to be the power of Europe, and if they wanted any chance of getting their land back, they kind of had to play ball a little bit with Germany, so they held their nose and did so. So they kind of hesitatingly, I would say, sided with the Nazis, and they would mainly fight Russia when the war broke out. They were very reluctant to fight the Western powers at all in direct armed conflict, and I don't believe they ever did. But they did send 100,000 people to the Russian front, which was an absolute disaster for Hungary. Hungary did contribute to the German war effort, though, by raw materials and by food and by oil, partly as a result of pressure from Germany, and also appealing to some more of the right-wing elements in Hungarian society. They started passing these anti-Jewish laws. And in 1938, the first anti-Jewish law came in, which limited the Jews to 20% in most professions. Now, at that time, ethnic Jews were doing very well. There were about 60% of the doctors were Jewish, 51% of the lawyers, 40% of the engineers, 35% of the journalists, 30% of the musicians. Jewish students occupied 25% of the slots and up to 43% in the Budapest Technical University. There was some resentment from the Hungarian people. Jews were still associated with communists. As I said, that Bela Kun Bolshevik government had a lot of Jews but they made the mistake of conflating, well, yes, Jews were disproportionately involved in Bolshevism, but that didn't mean all Jews were Bolshevik, especially the ones who had converted and had shown a lot of loyalty to Hungary. And Horthy always treated those Jews much better and didn't much mind about the Jewish laws passed against the other Jews. It was a bit pragmatic. Hungary was in a very tough spot because Germany had walked in basically to Austria and Czechoslovakia and could have walked into Hungary. Germany had a 10, if not 20 to 1 advantage in terms of manpower, and also had a much more advanced army at the time. Hungary had never rebuilt its military after World War I, not the way Germany had gone on entirely a war footing as soon as Hitler came in. And so they risked being overrun by Germans. So if they spoke out too loudly against Nazi Germany, Germany would just walk in, as they eventually did. So as I said, a series of Jewish laws. This first one, there's a second one which changed the definition of Jew. It used to be if you practiced the Jewish religion, you were a Jew. But here they changed it to racial grounds. So everyone had to scramble and try to get birth certificates from their grandparents to demonstrate if they were or were not Jewish. And a number of phony birth certificates got produced during that time. There was, in 1941, there was a third Jewish law prohibiting marriage, and this was a poster at the time explaining the laws, just ridiculous poster saying, if you're this much Jewish and this much not, it was verboten. It was okay if you were both three-quarters. And then the fourth Jewish law in 1942, that Jews just can't own land. And while this was going on, oddly enough, within within the sphere of influence of Nazi Germany, Hungary was still a refuge, and Jews still poured into Hungary despite all of this happening, because it was way worse elsewhere. But eventually the Germans did walk into Hungary. So this was happened. The setting of this was after about 2 years of war against the Soviet Union. The Prime Minister of Hungary began peace negotiations with the United States and the United Kingdom in autumn of 1943. Berlin was already suspicious of Horthy and the government of Prime Minister Calais, and so in September 43, the German General Staff prepared a project to invade and occupy Hungary. And it was partly because they wouldn't go hard enough against the Jews, and partly it was because Hungary was really starting to deal with the Allies. They fed the Allies intelligence. They were negotiating to change sides if there was an Allied invasion in the Baltic, which they were trying to keep the Germans guessing if the invasion would happen in Normandy or in the Baltic. And had it happened in the Baltic, it would have been critical for Hungary to change side suddenly. And so Hungary was willing to do that. And they had a deal where Hungary wouldn't shoot at bombers as long as Hungary itself was not bombed, which kind of enraged Hitler. The bombers just went unmolested over Hungary into Germany. And Horthy basically despised Hitler, and all his government despised Hitler as well. And so for that reason, they all just marched in. And it was peaceful because Horthy had been called to Berlin and held there while this was underway. By the time he returned, it was a fait accompli. He was actually greeted at the train station by an honor guard of Nazis, much to his dismay. Hitler had promised him that if he went back and installed a government that was more pro-German than the one he currently had in, that they would withdraw all their troops. And so they kind of cooperated, and they told the army not to fight the Germans, and there's a lot of miscommunications because Horthy, the head of the government and the head of the military, was out of the country and not able to direct them at all. So after the Germans came in, the Jews started being treated very badly by the Germans. They started being rounded up. They had to wear these yellow stars to indicate they were Jewish. And there were certain designated houses, the Yellow Star houses, which were formerly owned by Jews that were taken over. And then a whole bunch of Jews were piled in. So you'd have entire families living in single rooms within a house. And so they're all herded together. That was in a particular area of the towns. And then they were then taken out and put on trains and shipped to Auschwitz, where they were then basically murdered. They either died of overwork or disease or were outright murdered. All in all, before it was over, 50% of the Hungarian Jews, both from the countryside, well, more from the countryside, the ones in Budapest were protected to a certain extent. But 50% of the total Jewish population of Hungary was deported, and 85% of the deportees died at Auschwitz. But there were many Hungarians, of course, who despised the Nazis and hid and helped the Jews. And many Jews who had converted to Christianity found ways around the various Jewish laws or were hidden by fellow Hungarians. It wasn't clear what was going on at Auschwitz at the time. And there was something, eventually it became clear to Horthy what was going on. And he came under pressure from the Pope and from the Americans and from the British to put a stop to it. He was still nominally in charge of the government and in charge of the military, so he actually did put a stop to it. He got his military to stop all the deportations. But this, of course, enraged the Nazis, who then kidnapped Horthy's son. They put a gun to his head and made Horthy resign. Now, I should say the actual cause of that was that Horthy had attempted to surrender and declare the war over, surrender to the Russians. Even though he despised the Russians, it was better than the Nazis. And it was really this surrender that was actually broadcast briefly on radio across Hungary that the Germans really needed to eject Horthy from power for having done that. And they immediately kind of retracted that and said, no, we were just kidding. We're fighting on. And they installed this maniac called Ferenc Szalasi, the leader of the previously banned Arrow Cross Party, which was Hungarian Nazis, as the leader. They needed to find someone who would want to continue fighting the war, even though the war at this point was a lost cause for the Germans. and everybody acknowledged it except for Hitler. They put in this crazy man, Jalassi, who would keep fighting this lost cause. And Jalassi was a worse Nazi than the actual Nazis themselves. He accelerated the pace of the deportations. If it wasn't for Jalassi, far, far fewer would have gone to Auschwitz. He was eventually convicted in Nuremberg war trials and was hung. And about 3,500 Arrow Cross party members were put in prison, and many of the leaders hung as well, and did good riddance to them. So during this time, our family largely protected themselves by, first, they had converted early and they were Roman Catholics. They were wealthy, so they could bribe their way out of certain troubles. Some of the family went into these protected houses because they had these contacts abroad. Laszlo joined the army in the 1930s as a private. And he later on, after he left the army, he went to work on the work details. And if you were on the work details, these weren't, there were two kinds of work details: Jewish work details and non-Jewish work details. The Jewish work details were a death sentence. The non-Jewish work details, the Hungarian work details, were rough, but not nearly as bad. And if you're on those work details, you were not treated as like a Jew at that point. So he spent some time on those work details as well. There was a little story from that time where he was marching in such a work detail, and three Tommy gun carrying Hungarian Arrow Cross Nazis made fun of his group. He veered off, picked one of them up, dropped him on his head to the consternation of his buddies, and then he returned to the march. So he was an outspoken man and a very athletic man as well. Now, as soon as Germany was occupied, the Americans, the British, and the Russians all started bombing Hungary. Until then, until 1944, April of 1944, the war really hadn't touched Hungary. There's some shortages of some stuff, but apparently life just went on in Hungary. People dined in restaurants, drank at cafes, were out and about in the streets. And while it was unpleasant with the increasing Nazi influence around, the Hungarians were largely untouched by the war. Sort of like the war, if you're in Canada, you were largely untouched by the war, except there were shortages of certain things and drives for certain things as well. But eventually, when the Germans occupied, the gloves were off and Hungary came under attack. First by the bombers, and then the Russians started marching in. And the Russians, Romanians who were neutral, turned to help the Allies. And with the help of the Romanians, the Russians overwhelmed the German and what Hungarian forces were fighting with them. And they took over all of Hungary. They encamped around Budapest for a month or more, and then they finally entered Budapest on February 12th, 1945. Now, Uncle Egon said, upon seeing the first Soviet red flag, said presciently, and now comes the second act. So, and not in a good way. My mom has stories of this time. And so in 1944, during the siege, she was 12 years old. So that's old enough to remember what's going on. She remembers a man dragging butchered parts of a dead horse through the streets because people were hungry and starving. My mom's family survived largely on lentils. I guess they had a store of lentils saved up. And they had lentils for breakfast, lunch, and dinner during the siege of Budapest, which didn't last that long, but it was long enough from April 44 to finally February 1945 when the Russians marched in. My mom says she remembers she had a dream until very late in life of it being her birthday, and they get her a birthday cake, and then she realizes it's a cake made out of lentils. So anyways, but she also remembers walking around these bombed out streets and with her friends, and one of her friends knew how to defuse hand grenades. So she and Tom and the Farkas boys, who were friends that we met later on in life, made this their playground. I guess kids will make the best of whatever there is. Now, during the siege, apparently a bomb went through the roof, and Great Uncle Egon said, well, you can't live in a house with a bomb. So apparently some of the family said, no, just leave it there. Just leave it there. But Uncle Egon said, you can't live in a house with a bomb. So he picked it up and carried it down 2 flights of stairs and put it in a vacant lot next door. Alice accompanied him the whole way to ensure that if the bomb exploded, she would die alongside Egon. Uh, who cares about the kids, I guess? But that was nice that Ellis was so loyal to Egon. So then the Russian occupation came, and the Russians were way worse even than the Nazis. They came in murdering, shooting people, raping women right, left, and center, and stealing right, left, and center everywhere. And when the Bolsheviks came in, they especially targeted the intellectuals, the aristocrats, the property owners, and deported them. So my family had a double whammy. First, they were Jewish, and so they had to dodge around that. And then, of course, they were wealthy, and they weren't able to dodge that. And they confiscated all the property and nationalized all the businesses. So the Russians took my grandfather's factory, and he had also stashed away and hidden away about $10 million worth in today's money of semi-finished goods. And he was hoping to use that as capital after the war to restart. But the authorities found it and they took it. And they also took his factory, and they dismantled his 6 newest, biggest machines and shipped them somewhere else. But they didn't really ship them. They just dismantled them, put them on the railway tracks. Apparently 6 months later, they were still sitting there rusting. So they lost everything, and he managed to get out. So from over here in Hungary, he went to Trieste, which is here in Italy. So Trieste was just a little part of Italy that was carved out, had been for a while, from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So this was in Italy. And he worked as a bank manager at Bank Mobiliare Svizzera, Swiss investment bank. And I imagine he had a lot of dealings with them when he was a businessman, and they gave him a job in that bank, and he had previous banking experience. Now, the reason he left before the others is he wanted to get established, but he also wanted Tom to finish his last year of high school. So he wanted him to get that high school diploma, because wherever they were going to go, it would save a lot of time if he had his high school diploma and go straight into university there, which turned out to be true in Canada. Unfortunately, when he was separated from the family for about a year, he was working as the banker. He had 2 very serious nervous breakdowns that required him to be institutionalized for a time while he was there. So in August of 1948, Klara, Tom, and Marianne joined him in Trieste. And then from Trieste, all 4 went over to Rome to arrange to go somewhere else. My grandmother, of course, had to organize this escape to Trieste. And the border was getting harder and harder to cross in those days. And eventually it was shut down by the 50s, early 50s, was shut down entirely. The Soviet Union refused to let anyone else out because they were losing a lot of people, and they eventually shut it down. But in those days, it was still possible to get out, although you needed to kind of bribe your way out as well. But my grandmother was smuggling out a number of diamonds that she had embedded into sponges and then dried the sponges. At the border, they were stopped and inspected by the communist border guards. She apparently went into the border guard station. Don't know what happened there, but she came back out, and then they were free to go. But she had never spoken about what went on. They joined Laszlo in Trieste, and from there they went to Rome. Now, they were thinking about either going to Brazil, and this is where his little sister, 2-year younger sister, was heading. She went there in 1949. She and her husband had managed to preserve some of their estate, and they went to Brazil. But it was either that or Canada, where a friend of the families, Tiddy and Ernest Neubauer, had moved there. And I'll tell you more about them in a moment. Unfortunately, September 12th, 1948, 6 weeks after arriving in Rome, Laszlo committed suicide in the hotel suite while the others were out. My grandmother has said that he had developed an obsessive conviction that the family would be better off without him. And my mom says that she could see him staring blankly out the window and at the hotel, and had very bad premonitions about that. And in fact, it was my mom who discovered the body when they returned. He had hung himself off the balcony of the hotel suite. Well, the family settled down in Rome for a year while arranging their passage and immigration. My mom joined a very prestigious Catholic convent school in Rome. Apparently, they did a lot of skiing in the Alps. She grew to love Rome. For the rest of her days, there's no better place for her to go visit than Rome, and she knew it like the back of her hand. Every little church, every little alleyway, every nook and cranny of Rome. Eventually, Klara decided to take the family to Canada with the encouragement of our friends, relatives, Ernest and Tiddy Neubauer, who had arrived in Canada 10 years before that and said, "It's a great place. Come on over. We'll help you once you get here." And so that was very welcome, and they decided to go to Canada. So here is the record of them sailing. They sailed October 49 on the SS Atlantic, this ship here, to Canada. They arrived at in New York, Ellis Island. Klara Virany in transit to Canada, Thomas Virany, and Marianne Virany. And then they were from New York. They went to Canada, to Toronto. My grandmother. This is a picture from 1950. So they arrived just then. And this is a house that she bought on Points Avenue, 207 Points Avenue. This is 207 Points Avenue today on Google Maps. And you can see it's exactly the same. This is, I think the other houses around it got rebuilt, but that one happens to have still stayed there. And so she came here with her two kids, Thomas and Marianne. Now, my grandmother, she in Hungary, they were very, very rich. She came from a rich family. She married into a very rich family. Her husband was very rich as well. But she had grown up in the pushta on a farm. She was she did looked after the horses, did farm chores herself, things like that. So she was always a hard worker. And she just rolled up her sleeves and declared, "We're immigrants and immigrants work." So her first job was at downtown at the Woolworth lunch counter, I think washing dishes. And she later went into retail, and she ended her career as the head of the millinery, the hats department at Holt Renfrew's, which is the swankiest women's clothing store in Toronto. And hats were very important back then. And it so happened that they settled down. Points Avenue is here. And this is where my dad lived, down here, although they didn't meet until university. So Tom immediately got into the University of Toronto in engineering. But Marianne was a bit younger and hadn't graduated high school, so she wasn't able to get into university yet. So instead, there were, I guess, a program that was designed for the displaced persons, and she went to Hamilton to live with Tiddy and Ernest Neubauer. They helped her get through her pre-university preparatory year. This is a picture of her at around that time. Again, as I say, rare for pictures between this period, and there's Uncle Tom at around that time. I'll bet you he's doing a problem set or study. Tiddy and Ernest, how are they related? Well, the relationship to my mom is the maternal first cousin of husband of sister-in-law of grand uncle. So Marianne's mother, Clara's father, Sandor had a brother named Gyula. Gyula married a woman named Hilda Lichstein. And this is distinct. My grandmother's mother was called Sarolta Lichstein. But as far as I can tell, I don't know if these two are related. They must be, I figure, but I can't find the record of them being related at all. But maybe they are as well, like case of brothers marrying cousins or something like that. But anyways, I know this exists. So Gyula marries Hilda. And Hilda had two sisters and a brother, not shown here, Margit and Alice. Margit married a guy named Bella Delmar, and they had a daughter called Elizabeth Lizelot Delmar. And we spent a lot of time with Lizelot skiing on her cabin at Jay Peak when I was kids, and this is how we're related. But if you go over to Alice Lichstein, she married a fellow named Emil Reitler. And Emil Reitler, his father was Robert Reitler. Robert married Eugenie Spitzer. Eugenie Spitzer was the sister of Mathilde Spitzer, who married Isidore Neubauer, and they had Ernest, and Ernest married Tiddy. So that's the relationship. So it's a very distant relationship. Although Ernest told stories about his famous uncle Spitzer, Arthur Spitzer, who was a very, very, very wealthy man. And Arthur Spitzer would drive around in a very fancy car, chauffeur-driven car, and he'd tell his chauffeur just speed, go as fast as he could everywhere. He was an impatient fella. And at one point, a policeman turned on his siren. Arthur Spitzer, still going at full speed, he rolled down the window, threw out a bunch of cash, and kept going. That was the story about Uncle Spitzer from Ernest. Now, Ernest was a great, great man, and Tiddy was a absolutely wonderful woman. I knew them very well. We went up there very frequently, and they spent a lot of time at our cottage as well. We built a wing of the cottage to house them, in fact. They met when Tiddy was at a kind of a sanatorium, a place of recuperation. And I don't know exactly what she was recuperating from, but Ernest was her doctor there, or a doctor there, I should say. And they started their relationship there. And they got married and came to Canada. So here is actually their passage. They came on the Montclair, the Canadian Pacific steamship Montclair. And that's their entries here are the crossed out ones, Ernest Neubauer and Gertrude Neubauer over here. And race Hebrew, immigration year 1939. So they got out just before the war started. They were living in Hungary at the time, and or Vienna. Ernest went to medical school in Vienna. And he listed his occupation as farming. And apparently when the immigration people said, "Show me your hands," and he showed them his hands, and he said, just looked at him and said, "Yeah, you're no farmer." But he let them go in anyways, because they had brought some money with them, and I think they actually went and bought a farm in Aldershot, which is just outside of Hamilton. As I said, he was a wonderful doctor and a wonderful musician. He was a pianist. Born in 1899, the same year Laszlo was born, and he lived in Vienna before the war. There's a story from Aldershot where Ernest came out and wanted to help the farmhands. They had hired a farm manager, and the farm manager said, "Oh, no, Dr. Neubauer, the biggest help you can be is to play your piano while we work." And so Ernest went ahead and did that. Apparently Ernest wasn't that handy on the farm. They tell wonderful stories of Aldershot. They were relatively new in Canada in 1939, and a bit of exotic to the locals. Well, the locals tried to make them feel comfortable. One of them invited them to a party, and they said the party was informal, but they didn't know English so well, so they were puzzling over the word informal. What does this mean? So they figured it meant informal wear. So they got their gowns and tuxedos on and went to the party. And then the hostess saw them. Apparently she has such good manners that she immediately went upstairs and changed into her gown and tried to make them feel at home. Tiddy also, she complained about the English language. She said, "It's cloves, right? So these things that you put on your hands, why aren't those things gloves? Why are they called gloves? They should be gloves." So absolutely true. But they really, really helped my mom. And apparently Ernest wrote some of her essays for her, and they just really helped her get through that preparatory year, which actually got her into the University of Toronto at the end of the day. So here is my dad speaking at Ernest's funeral in 1988. And it's enlightening because it says a lot about my dad as well. I put up a little photo of Ernest with Alan Penny at Leonard Lake in the 70s. Ernest just had a way with people, and he could make anybody happy, anybody their friend. And so here's my dad's eulogy. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Douglas Penny. My wife and I are old and close friends of Tiddy and Ernest. I've been asked by Tiddy to say a few words today because, as you know, Ernest was not in any conventional sense a religious person. We're here this afternoon to observe the passing of our dear friend, Ernest Neubauer, and to share our sense of loss with our equally beloved friend, who must formally be called Gertrude, but whom we all know and love as Tiddy. All of us will have our own memories of Ernest. Perhaps I can speak for all of us if I speak personally. I first met Ernest when I became engaged to my wife Marianne, for whom Tiddy and Ernest were virtually second parents. I was a very young and inexperienced wasp, and I think that Tiddy and Ernest felt that if a nice, cultured European girl was going to marry a raw Canadian, they had better do what they could to civilize him. And they did, and it was what I wanted more than anything at that time, because I had come from an environment which had awakened my taste for the cultural tradition that Ernest and Tiddy represented, but which had not provided me with any way of developing it beyond my personal resources. And so visiting Hamilton was like being given the keys to a treasure house filled with art and music and fun and laughter, but especially music, with Ernest as a wonderfully wise and witty and kind and endlessly engaging and informative personal guide, so that I will always be grateful for that gift, and because of it I am in many ways a changed person. I know that many people in this room could make a similar statement, perhaps dealing with a different interest or need, but in all cases with some part of their lives and aspirations helped and shaped through having known Ernest. He was one of the most creative people I've ever known. His was an unconventional and original personality. He delighted in defying the conventions. I might remind you of just a few examples. He was a wonderful doctor, loved by his patients. He loved his profession and practiced it well and with incredible kindness, but he was certainly less than reverential about it and turned the usual sequence of things completely around by beginning his longest and most sustained period of medical practice at an age when most doctors are thinking of retiring. He was a man who loved companionship, but dodged social occasions whenever he could. But whether happily present or reluctantly present, he was invariably kind and charming to everyone, and often the life of the party. He was a man who was not religious, but who loved the art and music and architecture of religion, and who in his life almost certainly visited more religious buildings and heard Mass sung more often than many of even the most devout. He was a man of great talents, who could have succeeded in almost any field he wished. He practiced many arts, but the one he practiced to perfection, and which in a sense included all the others, and which made him so lively and refreshing and so full of fun and enjoyment, was the art of living. He suffered from a long illness which gradually deprived him of the ability to live as he wished to live, and led him to the point where he himself no longer wanted to live. So we cannot be sorry that after 89 years his life, which had become burdensome to him, has ended. That does not lessen the sense of loss we all feel, and especially that Tiddy feels. But although we cannot avoid that feeling, let us also remember that the best way in which we can honor his memory is to live as he would have wished us to live, with joy and pleasure and music. As we say goodbye today, let us remember his originality, his fun, his great kindness, and resolve, as he always insisted on doing, to keep the music in our lives. That was my dad, Douglas Allen Penny, speaking in Hamilton, April 6, 1988, on the occasion of Ernest's funeral. I spent a lot of time, and my sister as well, with Ernest and Tiddy. We, each of us went up to Hamilton for a week separately, and we were just spoiled absolutely rotten, and a lot of that that my dad talks about absolutely rubbed off on us as well. So just a wonderful man. So Tom graduates university and marries Margaret Kell on September 10th, 1955. They wind up having 3 kids, Leslie in 1961, Paula in 65, and Sandra in 66. And that's them at their wedding. So my family is now out and they're in Canada, thank goodness. But just to kind of end the story of Hungary, there was another Hungarian Revolution in 1956 where the Stalinist regime was really unpleasant. And the Hungarians were never really bought into all of this socialist stuff. And they revolted against it in 56. It was a huge spontaneous uprising. Russia eventually quelled it. They sent in the military in force and they quelled it. And during that time, a number of people escaped out of Hungary, both during the confusion, and I think the Russians deliberately let the border open a bit so all of the most dangerous dissidents would escape. So there was a great exodus of Hungarians after the 56 revolution as well. And America and Canada supported the immigration of these refugees at that time as well. But even after that 56 revolution, the USSR, played gently with Hungary because they knew it could happen again. And so Hungary was always less Soviet than the other Soviet countries. And I visited Hungary during the 70s and again in the 80s when they were still part of the Soviet Union. And it was much more relaxed, apparently. And it certainly appeared so to me. So the Iron Curtain fell in 1991, and Hungary had its first post-Soviet free elections just before that in 1990. All Soviet troops withdrew by June of 91. They joined NATO in 1999 and joined the European Union in 2004. And a new constitution for Hungary was adopted in January of 2012. It came into effect January 2012. So Hungary is a great example now of a very democratic country in Europe. So, phew, there you have it. The whole history of Hungary with the history of my mom and her time in Hungary and getting out of Hungary, and what a tumultuous time that must be. You know, she was very resilient. My mom was very resilient. My grandmother, very resilient. Tom, very resilient as well. And they just made a new life in Canada, and were very successful doing so as well. I have particular admiration for my grandmother, who just rolled up her sleeves and got right into it when she got here. And that spirit of hers was very pronounced throughout her entire life. And my mom, nothing could stop her. I think once you'd gone through all of that, everything else was a piece of cake, I suppose. So let's have a toast to my mom, Marianne Penny, formerly Marianne Virany, or Marie Anna Veronica Virany. Anyways, cheers, everybody. Have a toast. I hope some of my Virany relatives enjoyed this. And Uncle Tom, let's have a toast. Thank you very much for your copious notes. And thank my grandmother for all those photographs that she left us as well. I apologize if I got anything in that wrong. And I'm keeping all the raw material so I can do an edit if there's anything that's too wrong about it. But anyways, cheers, everybody. Until next time, and we'll get back to my mom and dad in Canada. Cheers.